So this section of notes is more talking about the theory of evolution. So anyway, the basic definition of evolution is the process where organisms change over a period of time. Okay, so basically change over time. And it's going to be a specific species of organisms. And a lot of the times a new species will form from a previous species. This is called speciation, which we'll talk about more in depth in a bit. Anyway, I'm not sure if y'all can see that yellow real well. Maybe red will be better. Let me write that again for you while I'm talking. So anyway, you have a bunch of different theories of evolution, and we've already talked about some when we were talking about the scientists. So anyway, we talked about several different ones, and so we're going to go a little more in depth with these different theories of evolution and talk about them. Some of the more widely accepted theories of evolution. So anyway, these theories of evolution, they are theories. Remind yourself that, you know, how a theory is. Theories do have a lot of evidence, but again, it's not like a law. I can't just prove it right now. So these theories attempt to explain the similarities and differences between species. Okay, so that's one of the goals of that these scientists, these evolutionary theorists, they're wanting to explain why certain species are similar and certain species are different. So then we have come to the basic definition of a species. You're going to see this definition in this unit and also our next unit, which happens to be our last unit. So you are going to see this definition of a species for the next two tests, but also our exam, of course, too. Okay, so a species is a group of organisms that look alike and they can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Okay, so key here, fertile. All right, so they can interbreed and they can produce fertile offspring. So what a species is not. Okay, so like a donkey and a horse make a mule. The mule is not a species because the mule cannot mate with another mule to form baby mules. Okay, the only way you get a mule is a donkey and a horse. Now, could a horse mate with a mule? Possibly, but again, that's two separate things. So a mule would not be considered a species. So they have to be able to produce fertile offspring. If you've ever heard of a liger or a tigon, okay, we may have time to talk about those, but it's a male. One of them is a male lion, female tiger. One is and vice versa, which one's male and female. Okay, but they're usually infertile. So a liger and a liger cannot have baby ligers, but a lion and a liger could possibly have a child. But again, it's not going to make a species. Oop. So population is organisms of the same species in the same place at the same time, and they're also going to compete for resources. Okay, so I talked about population very briefly before. So how about we say the red squirrel population in Jackson, Mississippi in April of 2008. Okay, so it's going to be a specific time, a specific place, and one species. Not every species, only one species. The habitat you can think of as their home. Okay, so this is a place where the organism lives. This is just some terminology. Adaptation is anything, a characteristic, might be a behavior, so it might be something physical like the way it looks, or it might be even a behavior that helps an organism to better survive. Okay, so adaptation is going to help them better survive. Hibernation, migration, those are more behavioral adaptations. Physical characteristics that are adaptations would be like having a longer beak or shorter beak, or being taller or shorter, or being a certain coloring. Competition, I think we all understand what competition is. Many of you right now are competing for the best grade in my class. Anyway, so competition is interaction among organisms to get better resources, might be a better mate, and then competition leads to competition to survive. You might not think competing for a mate is competition to survive, but you're competing to reproduce. So that is the continuation of your species. And then overproduction is making more offspring than your environment can actually handle. If your environment can only handle, if there's one tree in a subdivision, then you only have a spot for things that live in that one tree. Okay, so if you have a bunch of squirrels that want to live in the tree and you have a bunch of birds that want to live in the tree, okay, at some point you're going to have an overproduction because you don't have enough habitat. Okay, so, or maybe you have an overproduction as far as food go. You don't have enough food or you don't have enough water. Reproductive success is passing on of genes to the next generation. Okay, so reproductive success means you were able to successfully reproduce. Pretty simple. You were able to have a child, and in having a child, you passed on your genes to the next generation. And again, a lot of this we're talking, don't forget, we're not just talking about humans, we're talking about animals and plants too, because plants are, they adapt too. Variation, we've talked about genetic variation before, okay? Remember, variation is differences, okay, or a variety. So humans, we've mentioned that humans have a large amount of variation. We can look at humans and we look very, very different. We can see all these different traits. So humans have very, very diverse genetics, whereas some other organisms do not have very diverse genetics. Okay, like cheetahs were almost extinct. So they only had like a couple hundred cheetahs left, and the population is rebounding now. But whatever was left at their lowest point, that's all the genes that were left. So cheetahs don't have very much genetic diversity if you compare it to, like humans. So anyway, variation is your genetic differences in that one particular species. Struggle for existence, that's the idea that organisms compete and only the best fit for that particular environment survive. So when we talk about the struggle for existence, sometimes it's better to be teeny tiny and small for a particular environment. It's not necessarily the strongest. Okay, maybe if I'm a mouse, it's better to be small because then I can hide from the predators easier. So it just really depends on, what the environment is, and that can change, depending on the environment. Think about Australia. The environment in Australia has changed greatly after all the Australian wildfires that happened at the beginning of the year. So I imagine that, different organisms were more successful, and I'm sure they all struggled after the fires, but some were probably more successful than others. Like the koalas, for example, they were really worried about the koala population because, they live in the tree. I read an article that the scientists were saying that, like all the zoologists, they're saying that the animals that were able to, like the burrow underground animals, they were able to survive in much better numbers because they could get underground when the fire was passing. So anyway, descent with modification. Remember we talked about descent. So descent is your descendants. Okay, so this is saying your descendants are modified or change. Remember, modified is change. Okay, so your descendants will be different from you. And this is the idea that all organisms, descent with modification is the idea that all organisms share a common ancestor. But because of evolution, because species change over time, they become modified. So, with descent with modification, they're saying that, or the idea is that all the organisms, all the living things came from a common ancestor. But as different environments were different, nature selected the best adaptation. So whoever was the best adapted, they saw those adaptations more often in the resulting species or the descendants. So if you take a look at this picture, this is kind of showing that the idea that frogs and humans came from the same ancestor, that all living things would have came from a common ancestor, that idea. So that brings us to Darwin. So Darwin, as you recall, was the father of evolution. And his big theory was natural selection. Okay, nature selects who's best fit for the environment. So Darwin was English, he was from England, and if you recall, he took a voyage on a ship. The ship was named the Beagle. So 5 years he was on the ship. They stopped at different places, and he studied lots of animals and plants, different species, on different islands and continents even. He pretty much went around the world. Anyway, so he noticed that each species seemed very adapted to the particular environment. He noticed the traits very much matched what the environment was. So he could look at an organism and tell, okay, well, this organism lives here because of its particular traits. So, for example, you can look at a polar bear. I know I've mentioned polar bears a lot because it's just a very common animal a lot of people know about. But you can look at a polar bear and tell it's got very thick fur, it's got the fat, and it's white to be adapted to the cold, the polar areas of the earth. So anyway, he also studied fossils. So he looked at both living species and species that were extinct. And so he looked at those fossils on his voyage at these different places. And so he went on the voyage for 5 years, and then he wrote a book about all the things that he observed and his theory of natural selection. And the book was called On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection. So basically in this book, he came up with his particular theory of evolution, and this really changed the way people thought of things because he did have a lot of data. He gathered all this data from the real world when he went on this voyage. And so his evidence was pretty good for natural selection. So that is why he is considered the father of evolution, because he has great evidence for the theory of evolution by natural selection. Okay, and so looking at the title of his book, On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection, he goes into creation and where species must have originated from in his mind. Okay, so this is just showing you that a dolphin is better adapted to living in the water, and birds like the eagle is going to be better adapted for the air. And then this comic here is saying that women are not colorblind generally because they need it for shopping. That may be a little bit true. So Darwin's theory, let me move that for you. So Darwin's theory was based on having genetic variation, having differences between members of a species. If the whole species is exactly the same, there's no differences. What kills one will kill them all, so there's not going to be any natural selection. So his theory is based on having differences, and if you have differences, then that would make one thing better than the other. So in his theory, environmental pressures forced natural selection, forced nature to select who is better adapted. Okay, environmental pressures could vary depending on the environment and the conditions that were in that environment. If you're in a rapidly changing environment, well, you're going to see rapid evolution. But if your environment doesn't change for a very long time, you're not going to see as fast of evolution occur. So, again, he noticed that those who had the better adaptations for that particular environment were able to survive. If you survived, you reproduced. Okay, if you're dead, you're not reproducing. Okay, you either adapt or you die. You survive, you adapt and survive, or you're dead and you're not surviving. You're not reproducing. Okay, so based on Darwin's theory, evolution occurs because of natural selection. Because the environment was better for certain individuals lived, and they were able to pass their traits on. The individuals that did not live, they did. So their traits did not get to pass on. So anyway, one of the other things he said was that the environment doesn't dictate the changes. The environment doesn't cause the change in the organism, but it takes the genetics that are there and it helps dictate who will best survive. Okay, so he wanted to explain how species adapt to each of their environments over many generations. So we're going to talk about some specific examples of this. So, natural selection. So by definition, it's the way populations change as certain things reproduce and pass on their genes. So like I said, it's the survival and reproduction of organisms that are best adapted. Okay, so again, nature selects the best fit for that environment. Okay, so this is also known as survival of the fittest. Okay, so take a look at this little fish here. Well, he's not a little fish, but you know. So this fish is adapted to live in the dark. It has the light to attract prey. And the prey will come up to that light in the darkness, and then this fish has the giant mouth to eat the prey. I know you've probably seen this on Finding Nemo, but this fish is actually very adapted to the dark because of the light to attract the prey. Okay, so getting more into natural selection, there's 6 things that we see that natural selection depends on. One of those things is that all species have some genetic variation. Remember, that's genetic differences. Again, if we don't have any genetic differences, everything's exactly the same, then what kills one thing's going to kill everything. Okay, there's no differences. There's nothing to pick from to see what is the best traits. The second thing is overproduction. Organisms create more kids, more offspring than can survive in the environment. Okay, so that would go back to carrying capacity. Okay, we mentioned carrying capacity previously in the last video. So carrying capacity is like the maximum number of organisms that can live in that particular environment. So if you only have enough food for 100, then and you overproduce more than 100, then some of them are going to die. And the ones that are least adapted are going to be the ones that die. Third is struggle for existence, competition. Okay, we have to compete for survival. And that competition can include food, habitat, water, mates. You got to remember, we're also talking about plants here. Okay, so plants compete for space. Okay, so that kind of goes back to habitat. The fourth thing is adaptations. Natural selection depends on having adaptations. Survival of the fittest. Okay, organisms have to be better adapted, okay, in order for us to say natural selection occurred. Okay, so you're going to see those better, more fit adaptations. Okay, and so the ones that are more fit are going to actually reproduce and pass on those traits. The ones that are less fit are not going to reproduce. They're going to die before they get a chance to reproduce. Okay, so the traits. Now here's the kicker. Okay, the trait that is best adapted for that particular environment, it can be dominant or recessive. Okay, so if there's a recessive trait that is better adapted for that environment, then you will see the recessive trait more often. And this is one of the reasons why we cover genetics first. As you have probably noticed, we've talked a few times about genetics, how there is a connection with genetics and evolution. One example of that is the peppered moths. And so these peppered moths, they were in, I believe it was Europe, England, So anyway, there were two variations of these moths. They could either be gray or black. And so the tree trunks were gray originally. Okay, and so if the tree trunks are gray, then the gray peppered moths were going to camouflage better. And so the black ones would kind of stick out like a sore thumb, so the black ones would get eaten by predators. Well, after the Industrial Revolution occurred, and we had all the burning of the coal and fossil fuels in a certain area, where these peppered moths lives, the tree trunks became more black because the soot. And again, this is outside of a large city. I want to say it was like maybe London. I'd have to go back and look it up, but anyway. So when the tree trunks turned black, then that made the black moths better able to not get eaten. Okay, they were camouflaged better. So then the gray moths, we saw a decrease in their population. So you could actually see how the population of these moths change colors based on the environment. So dominant or recessive trait doesn't necessarily mean that you'll have more of the dominant, because if the dominant is not the favorable trait for that environment, then you're not going to see more of that, because they're going to die. So, and then of course this depends on the environment. Those peppered moths, in some environments the black may be, better. Some environments the gray may be better. Anyway, so reproductive success, organisms with your less favorable variations are going to probably die before they get a chance to reproduce and pass on their traits to the next generation. We've kind of mentioned that several times. So natural selection does depend on that. And then the last thing that natural selection depends on is descent with modification. And again, we've talked about that several times. And that's saying that all ancestors have a common ancestor. But because of natural selection, the traits that were better adapted to a particular habitat are more common. We see them more common. And, they have been modified as they've descended, because everything came from a common ancestor. They've been modified through natural selection as we descended. So this is just another little comic. Harold, I think you misunderstood. It's not survival of the fattest. That might be me. Okay, so what natural selection does not do is natural selection doesn't create new traits. It takes the traits that you already have available and it picks whichever one is the best for that particular environment to survive. So what happened is organisms that are living in the same area, a lot of the times they interact and compete. Sometimes it's organisms of the same species, sometimes it's two different species competing. Okay, and so whichever one outcompetes the other, whichever one's best adapted, they're going to live longer and survive and reproduce, and their traits get passed on. So eventually these traits that are better suited for that environment are going to happen more and more and more in that population, and then you'll have less and less of the unfavorable trait. Okay, so this is kind of called genetic shift. Okay, and it causes speciation. Okay, eventually that species becomes so different from the original one that we get a new species. Okay, so there's a couple methods of speciation, and we're going to be talking about each of those. So one method is called geographic isolation. So if you look at this top picture here, okay, you'll see that we have these organisms, the species, that have brown and red genes, okay? And then in the next, this would be the next picture, okay? So we'll go here. And then over time, they have divided into two or even more populations. Okay, and those two populations don't really interact, okay? So in this case down here, what divided them was some sort of a barrier. Maybe a river came up, maybe a road was put up, or a city was even put up, and it divides a population. Well, over time, you're going to have mutations occur, and natural selection is going to keep occurring. And over time, eventually, maybe in this set, all the green are phased out, and in this set, all the brown or phased out. And if you took away that particular barrier, that physical barrier, then they would not be able to interbreed anymore because they become so different over time. This takes a long period of time to occur. And so anyway, this is one method of speciation, how they could become a new species. So there are certain things that can affect survival when we're talking about natural selection. So things that make your population or organisms in the population more likely to survive as if they're resistant to disease. Okay, so if they're resistant to disease, then they're less likely to get a disease. And so, of course, the disease probably won't kill them, or they won't get the disease at all. Another thing is having greater genetic diversity. Okay, so that's genetic differences. So I mentioned the cheetahs earlier, and I mentioned how humans have a large genetic diversity. So let's talk about bacteria for a second. So back when we talked about mitosis and meiosis and reproduction, we mentioned that bacteria reproduce asexually. And because they reproduce asexually, they are genetically identical. They're clones. And we mentioned that they are genetically identical, and that causes them to die easier. What kills one bacteria will kill them all until a mutation occurs. And mutations don't just happen all the time. But if we consider how fast bacteria reproduce, well, yes, then mutations do occur frequently. And some bacteria are going to mutate more than others. But anyway, things that reproduce sexually are going to have greater genetic diversity because they produce haploid cells. So another thing is having a larger gene pool. Okay, so your gene pool is basically all of the genes for that species. Okay, so all your gene possibilities. Okay, so let's just say that we have pink, purple. Those are your only two options. Okay, well, you don't have a lot of choice there. Okay, but if you have pink, purple, yellow, orange, blue, green, okay, you have a lot more options to pick from. And maybe the only thing that can survive is the blue. Okay, so having a larger gene pool, having a larger amount of options for an adaptation is going to give you a better possibility to survive. So when we talk about diversity in the gene pool, remember how I said having greater genetic diversity is better, having a larger gene pool is better? Those two kind of go hand in hand. So genetic diversity is your variety of traits, okay? So this is what makes, like, all the humans different. We're the same species, but we're different from one another. Mutations are random changes in DNA. Mutations are the only way to get new traits in a gene pool. Okay, this is the only way. You can't just create traits. Okay, they believe that random mutations is what caused all the variety of life forms that we have today. So again, natural selection doesn't create new traits. Okay, but it takes the traits that you have and picks out the best ones. Okay, so again, mutations are the only way to add in a new trait into the gene pool or to make the gene pool bigger. So, just a refresher, traits are passed on from one generation to the next through genes. Your genes are little tiny sections of the DNA. So the total number of genes that account for every different trait in one species is called the gene pool. So again, as I mentioned earlier, humans are extremely diverse. Okay, we have lots of different hair colors, skin colors, eye colors. We have different heights and weights, our sizes and shape of our noses, eyes, eye shape, ear shape, and then that's just physical traits. Of course, there are more. But we also have different behavioral traits, personalities, different intelligence levels, different talents. So we have lots of genes that we can't even see that are in our human gene pool. So all the different genes that account for all these differences in humans make up the human gene pool. So species that have a large gene pool have more diversity because they have more choices of genes. They have more combinations of genes or alleles available to them. So a smaller gene pool is going to limit the species diversity. Okay, so like I've said before, if you only have pink and purple as an option, okay, that might not work for every environment. We might need a blue. Okay, so gene pools of species can increase due to mutations, or they can decrease if all the individuals that have that trait die out. Okay, like I mentioned before with the cheetahs, many of the cheetah population died out, so a lot of traits disappeared because of that. The last cheetah that had that particular trait, once it dies out, that trait's gone forever from that gene pool. So as a species becomes more and more specialized for one specific environment, it loses the ability to adapt to changes in the environment. Okay, so for example, a polar bear, like I said before, it's going to be very adapted to the polar climates. They're not going to be able to come to Mississippi and survive. They'll sweat to death in Mississippi. Whereas we have bears in Mississippi, the bears in Mississippi are much more adapted to our environment. So the more specialized an organism becomes to a particular environment, the less likely it is able to adapt to changes in their own environment. And also, if you look at the world, like the weather's been kind of different this year. So they're less able to adapt. Anyway, so species can lose traits through natural selection, as they die out. Also through genetic drift, extinction threat, so coming close to extinction, and also something called selective breeding. So we're going to talk about each one of those now. So gene flow is the movement of genes or alleles in and out of the population. So two of the ways that happens is immigration and emigration. Okay, so immigration is going in, emigration is going out. Okay, so let's pretend that I'm going to move from Mississippi to Florida. Okay, so I am immigrating to Florida and emigrating from Mississippi. Two things, they're both happening at the same time. Okay, because I'm leaving Mississippi, I'm emigrating from Mississippi, and I'm going into Florida. So genetic drift. So genetic drift is the change in a gene pool by chance. Okay, this is totally by chance. So if a species, so the example we're giving, if you have a species of insect, and they can have either white or brown eyes, and there's no benefit to either color, neither one is better than the other, and they're found equally, then just because of chance, you might have more with brown eyes 1 year. And so just because of chance, maybe you had 53% with brown eyes. Okay, then the next generation is going to have more people with brown eyes or more insects with brown eyes. And then over time, the population is going to drift towards having brown eyes because of that one time you randomly had more with brown eyes. So eventually, over time, the gene for white eyes could slowly decrease and slowly be lost. The threat of extinction, okay, so basically the threat of extinction would be like being an endangered species, okay, when you get to low numbers. So when you have a drastic decrease in the number of organisms in that species, that accelerates genetic drift, makes it a lot worse, okay. So whatever's left, the surviving organisms have a much more limited gene pool. And so that limited gene pool, that smaller gene pool, might favor a trait that was not favored in the original population, okay? So when that small population, the small amount of organisms that's left, when they start repopulating and getting their numbers back up, that's called the founder effect, okay, because they are founders. They're kind of what was left of the species, and so they repopulated that species. So there's something called the bottleneck effect, which can happen when you have genetic drift because of some kind of devastating event. So like in our area, a hurricane would be a devastating event possibly. So anyway, an example of the bottleneck effect would be like if you have a hurricane and your original population of mice were long-tailed, and then so only 20% survived, and they all belonged to this family that was mostly closely related because this one area didn't get hit as bad by the hurricane. Maybe this family lived in Van Cleve instead of Ocean Springs, and Ocean Springs flooded and Van Cleve didn't. But anyway, in this family, they have a defect that makes them have shorter tails. And so because they're the main ones that survived, now the population is going to have more shorter tails. And so that's because of the founder effect. So that changes the whole gene pool to make the new gene pool have much more of this genetic mutation or defect. And so now the short tails are going to be more common in the population compared to what the long tails would have been before this event. So, most of these events are going to be related to like natural disasters, earthquakes, volcanoes. I mean, it just depends on the area that, the environment, depends on the environment. Most environments are going to have some sort of natural disaster that is accustomed to that area. So like California has a lot of wildfires, but we have hurricanes. So nature uses natural selection and genetic drift for determining the genes that are passed on. So that's how things occur in nature. But we know humans also are going to choose traits that we think are better, primarily in our crops, but also they could be in like with animals too. So this is called artificial selection. And another name is selective breeding. Okay, so what's happening is that they're going to select which traits they want to breed, and they're not going to breed what they consider undesirable traits. Okay, so of course, money makes the world go round pretty much. So farmers are going to pick traits that are going to make them the most money. Okay, so like tomatoes, if we've got, these two tomato plants and one makes bigger tomatoes and they're sold by the pound, then I'm going to make that plant reproduce and not the one that makes the little teeny tiny tomatoes. Unless little teeny tiny tomatoes are, all the business. So anyway, so because this has been done so long with wheat, the wheat crop now has very little genetic variation. So there is some concern from scientists that wheat might not be able to grow in a variety of climates now, and they could be the wheat plants could be very susceptible to different plant diseases like funguses, or different pests like certain bugs could be attracted more. So remember, mutations are the only way to add back in genetic variations. And so, that's going to be something that generally occurs naturally. So in a stable environment, mutations don't typically have a lot of benefit, and sometimes they're harmful. Some mutations are positive, some are negative. But in a changing environment, that allows the organism, that particular species, to have more variety, and so they're more likely to adapt. Doesn't necessarily mean they're going to adapt, but it just gives them more options in adapting to a changing environment. So we see that they're most beneficial in a changing environment rather than a very stable and non-changing environment. So then you have antibiotic and pesticide resistance in gene pools. So antibiotics are used to kill bacteria. We've talked about that before, and not viruses, right? So pesticide is basically bug spray, and herbicides are going to be like weed killer. So it's a plant killer. So anyway, we use these things for different crops, for animals. They give, if you've ever been to the grocery store, you've probably seen chicken that's advertised as antibiotic free. Anyway, so when we continue to use things like antibiotics and pesticides and herbicides, then eventually there's going to be a genetic mutation that develops in the thing that we're trying to kill that's going to make it to where that chemical doesn't kill it anymore. Okay, so like in the case of bacteria, if you have a genetic disease like cystic fibrosis that gets frequent lung infections and they keep giving you the same antibiotic over and over, well, eventually you're going to have a bacteria in your body that mutates and that antibiotic is not going to work anymore. And then they might die from that lung infection. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. Same thing with bug spray. Eventually you're going to have a bug that survives. That bug that survives is the one that reproduces, and now you have lots of bugs that have that same gene. Anyway, so the concern is that all that will be left over is things that are resistant. Bacteria, insects, weeds that take over. So this is a picture. We saw this earlier, but it's a little bigger now. So if you look up here in the original picture, you have green genes, and then you got the one red. That red one is mutated, okay? And so the red in this situation is going to show a resistance to the bug spray, the insecticide, the pesticide. Okay, so he survives, all the others die. And then because he survives, guess what he gets to do? He gets to reproduce, and now all the bugs are resistant.